But very briefly, Wilbur had an over 50-year career on Wall Street, including 20 plus with the firm of NM Rothschild and Sons. He was instrumental in leading that firm's bankruptcy restructuring process. He formed his own firm, W.L. Ross & Co. in 2000, and really became, over a period of 17 years running that firm, a market leader in acquiring and restructuring companies out of bankruptcy. W.L. Ross was also an active investor in the international shipping industry, being a big investor in companies such as Diamond S Shipping and Navigator Gas. Also started the Transportation Recovery Fund together with Fearnley's, which today remains an active player in the space. More recently, 2017, Wilbur was named Secretary of Commerce in the first Trump administration. Remained in that position for the entire term of that administration. I think it's fair to say that Mr. Ross is in a unique position to comment on the current state of affairs facing the global economy and our industry. And I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Wilbur to the stage.
Hi, Ted.
Your mic sounds like it's working well.
Yeah, I have a
You're good.
lapel mic.
Is this working? That looks good. Okay. I think we're ready to go. So we had a little conversation to kind of prepare a little bit for this. And I know you have recently published memoirs that you want to talk a little bit about. And from my perspective, maybe think about and present to the audience, some of the key things that, you think are relevant in the situation that we kind of find ourselves in today, and just take through a few of your thoughts.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ted. I think to give a little bit of background as to how President Trump negotiates, how he thinks about trade, and particularly how he thinks about China. As I wrote in my book, which Ted has nicely given me a plug for, and which is available outside, President Trump first met President Xi at the initial state reception of the Trump administration. It was in March of 2017, and it was scheduled to start with a big ceremonial dinner at Mar-a-Lago at 6:30. But at 2 that afternoon, I got a call from one of Trump's aides saying that there would be an emergency National Security Council meeting at 4 o'clock that afternoon, so I should come over for that. Well, that meeting is the one which, as you'll see in the book, we're all crowded in this little tiny, very secure room, and that's where the decision was made to launch the 52 missiles into Syria in reprisal for their attack on an air base that we had. And President Trump made what I think might be the defining decision of that first administration. Namely, he decided not to postpone the launching of the missiles until after the conference. He decided instead to announce it at 7:15 that evening, right smack in the middle of the dinner with Xi. So we get there, and the reason I think he did that was he wanted to send a message, not just to Syria, not just to Iran, not just to Xi, but to everybody in the world. You push me too far, and you're going to get a response that you don't really want to have. And I think that's why there was relative peace and quietude in the world during the first Trump administration. Anyhow, so we get there at the dinner, and Xi occupied the entire dinner with a lecture on his version of the history of China. And he had just gotten through the colonial oppression and getting ready to talk about the Japanese invasion when an aide came up, gave Trump a little note, and I knew what the note was going to say. It was going to say about unleashing the missiles. So Trump said, well, excuse me, President Xi, I don't mean to interrupt, but, and then he announced about the missiles. Xi, who had been speaking in Chinese through an interpreter the whole time, suddenly said in perfect English, repeat, please, repeat, please. The first hint we had that he was quite fluent in English. So Trump repeated it through the interpreter. Xi, without batting an eye, said, well, Mr. President, you've surely had a busy afternoon. That was the only time in the whole conference that he ever mentioned it. So in addition to learning that he was fluent in English, we learned this is a guy who doesn't go off message. He doesn't blink. He doesn't get confused. He doesn't get excited. And so it led to an interesting combination of two strong personalities on opposite sides of the same equation. And Trump, to this day, has not forgotten, and I'm sure President Xi has not, that event. Now, why is that significant? That was the first time we started to come face to face with Trump's then forming decision that China was the really formidable factor, not just in trade, but militarily and every other way. So I think that session totally conditioned him. The second chapter in his relationship with Xi was later on. Toward the end of our administration, we negotiated a phase one deal with China that did not touch on some of the sensitive issues like intellectual property and all that, but in theory at least, there was going to be much more purchasing of American goods by the Chinese. The only problem is they never implemented the agreement, and more recently they've announced that when Biden came in, they didn't see any necessity for living up to it. So I think one of the things that will condition any arrangement we do make with China will be enforceability of whatever it is agreed, and what punishment is automatic if someone does not abide by the agreement. So in addition to the various other complexities, I think that's an element that has not historically been a factor in our trade agreements, namely really making sure of enforceability. What we did put in that agreement was a tariff on electric vehicles, which they were not even selling us at that point. This is way before they became such a power in vehicles. And that was the start of the demonstration of Trump's fixation on autos in general from foreign countries, and especially autos from China. And you'll see that being carried through. Just now, he indicated that roll-on, roll-off shipments from China would be subject to a special tax. And so would the vessels, Chinese vessels hauling them. So there's a real continuity of that. And I think that's what led to his current position, which is being much tougher on China than on anywhere else. And interestingly, he's also much tougher on Asia than on Latin America. If you notice, many Asian countries are being subjected to 40 or so percent tariffs, which pretty much is saying you're not going to do business with us, because 40% is not an absorbable tariff. Whereas most Latin American countries, he's only subjecting to a 10% tariff. Well, 10% is absorbable between the host country absorbing some, the exporter absorbing some, and the importer absorbing some, and then the public absorbing some. That's assimilatable. So if that doesn't change, I think you're going to see a massive transfer of wealth from Asia to Latin America because of what he's doing with the export policy. So that's kind of a long-winded...
I was going to say, you make asking questions very easy. You make asking questions very easy. So, fast forward to where we are today. You just covered a lot of ground. China is the 500-pound gorilla in the room, is what I think you're saying in terms of where these trade talks and tariff talks eventually go, impacting all nations really, or all major trading partners. How do you assess? And there's been some toing and froing in the last 30 or 45 days between the U.S. and China. There were recent conversations, and things look like they restart. And there's some agreement of some kind that has been announced, or at least that's what Mr. Trump is saying. How do you see this kind of playing forward in the next, whatever it is, 30, 60, 90
You mean
days?
with China or with Asia in general?
Well, I think let's start with China, because it feels like that's going to drive a lot of the other discussions.
Yeah, I was a little surprised to see the tariffs being so strong on Vietnam, because the reason Vietnam is now such a major exporter to the U.S. is one simple thing, namely the big tariffs that that Trump put on China a year or so ago. So we, in effect, created them as a very logical substitute for China. So hopefully they will work out some accommodation, because it would be a little strange to have created them in a position of being a replacement country for China and now punishing them for having accomplished that mission. So that I find a little surprising. Vietnam obviously is quite desperate to make a deal with us, and my guess is there will be a deal, because he has no natural reason to be punitive toward Vietnam. And in fact, since Vietnam and China are historic enemies, not allies, even though there was a lot of transshipment in Trump's first administration, a lot of transshipment from China through Vietnam to take advantage of lower tariffs. But I don't think he holds that against them. In terms of the rest of Asia, he clearly is being very, very friendly with India. India is always a little slow to come to making a decision because it's such a fractured government, a coalition government. But India already has been a beneficiary of Apple, for example, moving a lot of assembly to India. So I think India is a good candidate to make a deal pretty soon. And I think so is Japan. As you know, initially during the campaign, both President Trump and President Biden were against the Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel takeover. I wrote editorials supporting it because I don't see any national defense issue, and I think it will result in a much stronger U.S. steel industry than we had before. but I can't imagine that Trump would have finally approved the deal with the golden share, except if he felt we were going to be able to make an overall accommodation with Japan. So I view that as a very hopeful sign in terms of Japan.
So I'm going to segue a little bit off that last comment into the topic we've been focusing on in the earlier sessions here, which is some of this new initiatives and the SHIPS Act, which is being coming through Congress, talking about restoring U.S. shipbuilding capacity over a period of time. Do you think Japan could be a part of that in terms of investing into the U.S. shipbuilding business? Do you think that could be part of a framework of a deal?
You're talking about reshoring?
Yep. Yes.
Yeah. He's quite serious about that. And one extreme example is his interest in the U.S. shipbuilding industry, or the to become U.S. shipbuilding industry. The objective, as they've stated it, is to build 250 vessels over 10 years. That's a huge, huge amount of money, even allowing that some will be civilian vessels, some will be military vessels. It's going to be a huge, huge thing. It's also a very heavy lift. As you know, other than the Jones Act, we haven't been doing much shipbuilding at all. And in terms of military vessels, Navy vessels, we do maybe one big one every 3 years. So to go from that to an average of 25 a year is an enormous escalation. It clearly will involve big subsidies, probably for the establishment of yards, for expansion of them, and most importantly, for the training of workers. As everybody in this room knows, shipbuilding is not the world's easiest thing. I think it's more akin to building a spacecraft than it is to any other kind of manufacturing. Takes a lot of skills, takes a big progress along the learning curve to get to where you're remotely efficient. And plus, welding is obviously a very, very critical component of shipbuilding. And we already have a big shortage of welders in the U.S., where a lot of community colleges are offering courses to young people and old people learning how to weld, because those are pretty good jobs. Those are $100,000 a year jobs. So it's going to be a very heavy lift, but I think he is quite determined to do it, because we have finally woken up to the change. Remember, at the time of World War II, we had a huge merchant marine fleet as well as a very good-sized navy. Now, China's navy is far more significant than ours, and China and other countries have far more merchant vessels than we would have. So I think that's going to create a whole new set of opportunities. I think the challenge will be, can they make our merchant vessels ones that will be competitive with Korean or Japanese or Chinese vessels in the international arena independently of the U.S.? And frankly, I'm a little skeptical about that. I just think our cost structures are fundamentally higher here than would permit that. But there's an awful lot of U.S. traffic that certainly could be put to work on it, and depending on how big the subsidies are and for how long, they could be a very competitive factor. So I think the other important thing, this is the first time that a government remotely of our size has shown that much interest in shipbuilding and in shipping. So it's making the industry front and center, and I think that will carry over to other countries as well.
You talked earlier about you saw a transfer of wealth from Asia to the Latin
Yeah,
American.
I'm having a little trouble hearing.
Sorry, you mentioned earlier you saw potentially a transfer of wealth from the Asian countries to the Latin American countries as part of the tariff as they work their way through the system as it looks today. What kind of implications do you see that having for the global shipping industry?
Well, I think there will be something of a slowdown longer term in the rate of growth of the world economy, and particularly in the rate of growth of shipping as a total industry. Shipping, as you know, marine transport has tended to grow somewhat faster than world economic growth in general. And that was because many countries, but mainly US, had these very unrestrictive policies. But the US is clearly going on a much more protectionist stand that will provoke a certain amount of reshoring. And it will also provoke a certain amount of near-shoring, especially to Mexico, because the transportation distances are so much shorter. And Mexico is pretty price competitive with even China now, because their wages haven't gone up too much and their currency has been very, very weak. So for those two reasons, Mexico, in addition to Vietnam, has already been a big beneficiary of the Trump policies. But I think there's another factor that will also occur. We're not the only country that has been running a trade deficit with China. Most other countries also have trade deficits with them. But how have they financed their deficits with China? It's mostly been surpluses with us. To the degree that Trump succeeds in reducing our imports from countries other than China, they're not going to be able to afford to bring in as much from China as they used to. So I think that will compound both China's own internal economic problems and will also tend to reduce somewhat the rate of growth in marine transport. So I think it's going to be a constricting factor. I also think there's a high probability that other countries, to protect themselves, will erect higher barriers against China. And I think some of our trade treaties probably will incorporate that kind of a feature, because otherwise you'll run into what we did last time, which was a low tariff country on a given product to us suddenly becomes an importer from China, and maybe they put a few finishing touches on the product. Maybe they don't even do that. But in any event, they serve as a conduit for transshipment. That doesn't really add anything to that economy. And so I think we will be encouraging them to put barriers against that, and they probably will be doing it on their own anyway. I think there's a final factor that will tend to constrict things, and that is, it's pretty clear that the world is heading toward defense buildups. You see it starting to happen in Europe in a big way. You see Canada starting to do it. Asia is certainly doing it. So one industry that I think will be very much a growing one is going to be defense spending. We're clearly in a more dangerous world than we thought we were in a decade or two ago. And so I think that's going to change the mix of what gets exported and what gets imported.
President Trump is very keen to expand U.S. exports across the board, of course, but very much so in energy. Asia are the big markets for U.S. LNG, to a certain extent U.S. crude. How do you see that part of this kind of playing out? I think what you were describing earlier about generally a slower world economy as these barriers go up, and there is reshoring or nearshoring, so value chains and logistic chains are getting altered. To me, that feels like more of an impact of the container trades and the dry bulk trades. Then I'm wondering about whether, A, what you think about that, and how about the energy exports from U.S.?
Well, much of the world cannot feed itself, especially China. China only has 11% of its total land mass that's arable. And in addition, the farms, because of the topography being so rocky and mountainous, tend to be very, very small farms. And that means they can't take advantage of the superior farming techniques that we use in the US. That takes big farms, so you can use the big equipment and all sorts of chemicals and stuff. So I think export of food is going to become even more important, and Brazil and other countries are clearly going to be big beneficiaries of that. Brazil and Argentina particularly. I don't see that China can get to feed itself for the reasons that I mentioned. I also think that there will be continued growth in demand for LNG, LPG, crude oil, and various chemical products. As the world continues to industrialize, which I think they will, and as living standards tend to go up, I think the consumption of hydrocarbons in one form or another is also going to grow. And again, it's a situation where China is never going to be able to provide its own hydrocarbon needs. And there's a reason for it. They have a lot of theoretical reserves of hydrocarbons, but theirs are from the late Paleozoic era. Ours in the US are from the early Paleozoic area. Ours are mostly from the late Paleozoic era. The reason that matters is because of the longer time since the Chinese reserves were created, there's been more tectonic movement underground. And as a result, instead of the very wide and long reservoirs that we have here, theirs are all fractionated. They're very small reservoirs, very expensive, very hard to get the material out. So that's a real problem for them, and that's not one that's going to get solved very easily.
Okay, we still have a bit of time. I mentioned your involvement in Diamond S Shipping and Navigator Gas, among other shipping investments. I wondered if you could give some reflections on what you learned from those experiences, and how you generally feel about the outlook for, the global shipping industry as we look ahead into this environment you're painting.
How I felt about.
Well, talk about your experiences with Diamond S and Navigator Gas, kind of what you took away from that, and how you think about the outlook for the market and the shipping business as we look ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I still didn't get the question.
Okay, let me try it again. I'm keen to hear your experiences with Diamond S as an investor and with Navigator Gas.
Oh, with Trump?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the way I met Donald Trump was under very adverse circumstances. In 1990, he had decided to build a casino in Atlantic City, New Jersey, the Trump Taj Mahal. And he built it right on the boardwalk, enormous project, very glamorous, glittery project. And he got two big American investment banks to underwrite $800 million of mortgage bonds for this startup casino. The only problem is they never made one single interest payment. The bonds actually defaulted before the first interest payment. So that naturally made the bondholders quite upset. They hired me to help them claw back their value, because the bonds that less than 6 months earlier they had purchased at par were now trading at 20 cents on the dollar. So as soon as it got announced that they were hiring me, Trump called me, and this was the Thursday before Memorial Day weekend. And he said, "You got to come down to Atlantic City tomorrow and we'll start the discussions." Well, the last place I wanted to be on Memorial Day weekend was Atlantic City, New Jersey, with tens of thousands of people playing slot machines. But in any event, I agreed to go down. So I show up at the 62nd Street helipad, and there was his plane, his helicopter, huge nail-polished red letters, TRUMP, on the side. So it was easy enough to pick it out. So we land in Atlantic City about 30 minutes later, and he's there right on the boardwalk in a big stretch limo waiting for me. And as I got into the car, I noticed there were two flags on the front bumper. One flag was a US flag, and the other was a Trump flag. And even more interestingly, the Trump flag was a little bit bigger than the US flag. So I now had my first exposure to Trump's penchant for understatement of things. So we get into the casino. People are swarming all over him. He clearly had become a cult figure, and people were having him sign their beanies, sign their notepads. One lady was in a bareback dress. She had him sign her back. Now, why she wanted Donald J. Trump and magic marker on her back, I'll never know. Anyhow, this was all part of a build-up to try to convince me that even though he knew the bondholders were giving very serious thought to kicking him out, that we shouldn't do it because he was such a draw, he individually, to the casino. So we go upstairs and we start trying to negotiate. He started out by saying, as you know, the bonds are trading at 20 cents on the dollar, and I think your holders will be lucky if they end up with 20 cents. So why don't we just do this? I'll personally guarantee the 20 cents. We can agree now and we won't have to have a big discussion. I said, well, Donald, the only problem is they hired me in the expectation that they're going to get 100 cents plus their back interest plus some stock in the casino. So we went at it for a couple of hours, wouldn't get anywhere at all. And I finally said, well, Donald, is this it? 20 cents is as far as you're willing to go today? He said, yes, 20 cents. I said, well, I'm not going to waste my time here. And I walked out on him. And that was a great shock to him, because that was the kind of tactic he was used to using on other people. So it was a little bit of corporate jujitsu to have this done on him. The following week, we resumed discussions, and it lingered for a couple of months with very public acrimony. And that was where I learned another thing about him. He likes to negotiate everything in the media. Then you've seen that in full bloom with the trade talks and other things. So we get into October, and we were getting closer and closer to what we wanted. So one morning I went over to his office and said, Donald, this is our best and final offer, and either we make a deal today or we're going to file an involuntary Chapter 11 petition on the Taj and put it into bankruptcy first thing tomorrow morning. He rejected my proposal. So I went back to the office and put out a press release saying the Trump Taj Mahal bondholders are planning to have a very important press conference at the Marriott Marquis Hotel at 5 o'clock tonight. We picked the Marriott because it was not one of his properties. So as soon as that hit the news wire, he called me. He said, what the hell is this? What is this, a press conference at the Marriott Marquis? What are you going to say to the press? I said, well, Donald, I told you that if we didn't make a deal today, we were going to put you in Chapter 11, then you turned the deal down, so that's what we're going to announce. He said, well, let me meet with my advisors. We went back and forth the rest of the day. We finally reached an agreement very close to what our target was. So he then said, but one more thing. And I had spent enough time with him to know when he says, but one more thing, it's usually quite a zinger. Well, this time, the one more thing was, and you have to move the press conference from the Marriott to the Plaza, because the Plaza was one of his hotels. So that taught me a lot about his negotiating style. And we actually became friendly after all this. And he later hired me to clean up some other messes that he had gotten into. But the story doesn't quite end there. This had been, as you might imagine, a pretty stressful, long day for me. So I'm getting in the limo to be driven home, and the phone rings. This is your mother, said in just that angry a tone. And I said, well, hi, Mom, everything okay? No, everything is definitely not okay. I said, well, what's the matter? She said, well, I've been playing mahjong with my lady friends while we've been watching that disgraceful press conference you put on with Donald Trump. And we all conclude that after all the mean things he said to the press about you, you should not have made a deal with him. I said, well, Mom, but that's how I make my living. That's what people pay me to do. And she said, well, if you had only become a lawyer like I always wanted you to, you wouldn't have to hang around with people like that. And she hung up on me. Some weeks later, she forgave me for the deal with Trump, but she never did forgive me for not becoming a lawyer. So that was my reward for having my first encounter with Trump. And he tells the story pretty much the same way, but that's how he decided I might be useful to him in the cabinet for trade negotiations and things like that.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. I think we're at our end of our time. So I'm going to thank you very much for all of your insight, and please join me in giving Wilbur Ross a big hand.
Thank you.
Very interesting stuff. Is this your? Yeah.
Please buy the book. It will help my personal balance of payments.
Can I get a quick picture of this? Of course. Sit. We stay seated.